Imagine you haven't eaten a full meal in 6 days, not because you're lazy, not because you forgot to hunt, because the world outside your shelter has turned white, and everything that used to feed you is gone or hiding or dead. The berries are gone. The leaves are gone. The rivers are frozen solid enough to walk across. And the animals you used to track by their footprints in soft mud are now buried under snow that swallows sound, swallows scent, swallows every trick you used to rely on. You can see your breath. You can feel your fingers going numb inside strips of hide wrapped around your hands. And somewhere behind you, in a shelter barely holding back the wind, are people counting on you to bring something back. For most of human history, winter wasn't a season, it was a test, and a lot of people failed it. Today, when it gets cold, you turn up the thermostat, you put on a hoodie, you order food that arrives at your door in 30 minutes regardless of what the sky is doing. Winter for you is a mood, maybe a mild inconvenience, maybe an excuse to stay inside and watch something. But for a human being 30,000 years ago, winter was the single deadliest stretch of the entire year. More ancient humans died in the cold months than from predators, disease, and violence combined, according to skeletal analysis from Ice Age sites across Europe. And it wasn't just the cold that killed them. It was what the cold took away. The first thing winter takes is food. Most large game migrates or goes dormant. Plants die back completely. The calorie-dense resources that carried a group through summer and fall simply vanish for months at a time. Archaeologists studying Upper Paleolithic sites in France and Central Europe have found something telling in the bones left behind at winter camps, a much heavier reliance on stored fat, marrow, and preserved meat than at any other time of year. These weren't people casually snacking, they were rationing survival. The second thing winter takes is mobility. Deep snow means every step costs more energy than it should. A twisted ankle that might heal fine in summer becomes a death sentence when you can't reach food or shelter. Groups that were spread out and mobile for most of the year suddenly had to compress into smaller ranges, sometimes staying in a single cave system for months without moving. And the third thing winter takes, maybe the cruelest one, is time. Because when the cold sets in, the sun barely shows up. In parts of Ice Age Europe, daylight in deep winter could shrink to 7 or 8 hours, and even those hours were often gray and half-lit. So people weren't just cold and hungry, they were stuck in the dark together for weeks at a stretch. So how did they not just survive that, but come out the other side of it as a species that eventually built cities? The answer starts with fire, but it doesn't end there. Keeping a fire alive through an entire winter wasn't a background task. It was arguably the single most important job in the group. Excavations at sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, occupied around 26,000 years ago, show hearths that were used continuously and rebuilt again and again in the exact same spot, meaning the fire location itself became a fixed point that the entire camp was organized around. People didn't just keep fire going. They built their whole living space in relation to it. But fire alone doesn't get you through 6 months of cold. You need fuel, and fuel is a problem when every tree is either frozen solid or buried under snow. So groups had to plan ahead, stockpiling dry wood, bone, and even dried dung during the warmer months specifically because they knew what was coming. Bone actually burns surprisingly well once it's dry. And at several mammoth-bone dwelling sites in Ukraine and Russia, archaeologists have found deliberate piles of bone fuel stored alongside the structures themselves. These weren't people improvising in the moment. They were preparing months in advance for a crisis they knew was guaranteed to arrive. And that brings us to clothing, because fire keeps a room warm, but it doesn't keep you warm when you have to leave that room. Here's something that genuinely surprised researchers. For a long time, scientists assumed clothing was a fairly late invention, something that showed up gradually and casually. But genetic studies on human body lice, which only live in clothing and can't survive on bare skin, suggest that humans were wearing clothes at least 170,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier. That's not a small detail. That means clothing wasn't a convenience. It was a piece of survival technology that predates almost everything else we associate with early humans. And by the time you get to sites like Sungir in Russia, dated to around 34,000 years ago, the evidence gets almost unbelievable. Burials there include thousands of ivory beads, and based on where those beads were positioned on the skeletons, researchers have reconstructed elaborate fitted clothing. Hooded parkas, trousers, boots, garments sewn with a level of precision that wouldn't look out of place in cold weather gear today. Someone in that group knew how to tailor clothing to the human body, not just wrap it. And that only happens through repetition, trial and error, and time spent specifically on the problem of not freezing to death. Which brings us to the deeper question. Where did that time come from? It came from being trapped. When a group is stuck in a shelter for weeks with limited food, limited light, and nowhere to go, something has to fill that time. And the archaeological record shows exactly what filled it. Bone needles with eyes small enough to thread sinew appear at winter-occupied sites with striking consistency. Someone sat for hours, in low firelight, drilling a hole smaller than a grain of rice into a sliver of bone. You don't do that task while running from something. You do it when you have nothing but time and a very good reason to use it. At several sites in Siberia and Central Europe, archaeologists have also found large concentrations of ivory and bone-carving debris clustered around hearths used specifically in winter layers. Not summer layers, winter ones. Meaning the carving, the small figurines, the decorated tools. A huge amount of that creative output happened specifically during the season when people were stuck inside. And this is where it gets genuinely strange, because winter might be connected to something much bigger than tools and clothing. Some of the oldest and most elaborate art in the world comes from exactly this kind of forced winter confinement. The famous Venus figurines, small carved statues of the human form, found across Ice Age Europe from France to Russia, cluster overwhelmingly at sites associated with long winter occupation. Carving one of these from mammoth ivory or soft stone takes patience, fine motor control, and hours of uninterrupted focus. It's not something you squeeze in between hunts. It's something you make when hunting simply isn't an option. And there's a theory, one that a lot of anthropologists take seriously, that winter is when ancient humans developed their most complex social behavior. When a group is forced into close contact for months, conflict becomes far more dangerous than usual. You can't just walk away from a disagreement when walking away means freezing or starving. So groups under winter pressure needed better systems for cooperation, for sharing resources fairly, for resolving disputes without violence. Some researchers argue that early forms of ritual, storytelling, and even music developed specifically as tools to manage that pressure, to keep a group functioning when they had no choice but to be near each other, day after day, for months. Bone flutes, some of the oldest musical instruments ever found, come from sites in Germany dated to around 40,000 years ago, and they appear at locations consistent with long winter habitation. Someone carved precise finger holes into a bird bone or mammoth ivory to make music, in the dark, in the cold, surrounded by people who had nowhere else to be. That's not a coincidence. That's what happens when you take a highly social species and lock it inside for a season. And winter wasn't only taking things away. It was also teaching a very specific lesson, one that might be the most important thing ancient humans ever learned. The future is real, and you have to prepare for it before it arrives. Storing food isn't instinctive in the way eating is. It requires imagining a version of yourself weeks or months from now, one who will be hungry and cold, and making sacrifices today for that future person's sake. The archaeological evidence for deliberate food storage, pits dug for preserving meat in permafrost, caches of nuts and dried fish hidden near winter camps, shows up again and again at sites with harsh seasonal cold. That kind of planning is a cognitive leap. It's the difference between living moment to moment and living as a species that can think in seasons, then years, then generations. So when winter finally broke, when the light came back, and the snow started retreating, and the first green things pushed up through the mud, the people who walked out of those shelters weren't the same as the people who walked in. They walked out with tailored clothing built through months of practice. They walked out with tools carved during weeks of enforced stillness. They walked out with songs and stories that had been rehearsed and refined around the same fire for months at a stretch. They walked out with stronger bonds to the people who'd shared that darkness with them, because surviving something together does that. Winter didn't just test ancient humans, it built them. Every hard skill that required patience, sewing, carving, music, storytelling, the careful maintenance of relationships under pressure, all of it had a season where it was forced into existence, whether people wanted it or not. The parts of being human that we consider the most human, art, cooperation, foresight, might not have developed despite winter. They might have developed because of it. So the next time the temperature drops and you're annoyed about scraping ice off your windshield, remember that the discomfort you're feeling is a rounding error compared to what your ancestors faced every single year for hundreds of thousands of years. And everything soft and comfortable about your life right now, the heated room, the stocked pantry, the fact that you're not currently carving your own needle out of bone by firelight, all of it exists because somewhere back in the deep cold, someone figured out how to survive the season that was trying to kill them, and then taught the people around them how to do it too.